Welcome back to the fire. Pull up a chair, grab a drink, and settle in for some fireside gossip. Tonight, we're looking at a woman who became a myth before she was even a memory. We're heading to Vienna, a city that runs on waltzes, pastries, and suffocating multi-generational imperial dread. Tonight, we're talking about Empress Elisabeth of Austria. You probably know her as Sisi. She is the tragic, beautiful, wandering ghost of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. If you go to Vienna today, her face is on every coffee mug, chocolate box, and tote bag. They sell her as a fairytale princess. But forget the romantic movies. Forget the sweet, smiling girl in the pastel dresses. We're looking at the brutal reality of what happens when you trap a free spirit in a gilded cage, and she decides to pick the lock with a starvation diet, a boat ticket, and pure, unfiltered spite. Was she a victim of a toxic royal system? Absolutely. Was she a deeply complicated, often selfish woman who turned her own body into a weapon of control? Also yes. Let's dig in, shall we? Before we get to the royal trap, you need to understand where Sisi came from, because she wasn't bred for the throne. She was born into the Wittelsbach dynasty specifically, the chaotic, folk-singing, emotionally ungovernable branch of Bavarian royalty. Her father, Duke Maximilian Joseph in Bavaria, was not built for stiff court life. He preferred taverns to protocol. He travelled constantly, played folk music, took lovers freely, and vanished for adventures as though responsibility were optional. He mingled with actors, circus performers, commoners, anyone more interesting than aristocrats. Royalty to him was a loose suggestion. In other words, Max was a male version of Sisi. He was the prototype. She would become the pressure-cooked edition, but we'll get to that. Her mother, Princess Ludovica, was the rigid one, the stabilizer trying to hold the whole thing together. She was managing an eccentric husband, a financially strained cadet branch of the family, and 10 children in a household that ran more on impulse than structure. Sisi was just one of the pack. She wasn't the chosen one. She wasn't groomed for diplomacy. She wasn't trained for court theatre or statecraft. She grew up at Possenhofen Castle by Lake Starnberg, riding horses for hours, climbing mountains, writing poetry, avoiding tutors. She roamed. And that right there is the key to everything. That feral, unsupervised childhood explains the horse obsession. It explains the romantic fixation on escape. It explains the allergy to confinement. So when she was dragged into the suffocating, hyper-controlled world of Vienna, she didn't just struggle. She felt like she was choking. She never adapted, because she was never built for it. And so how does this wild child end up in the Austrian capital? Well, let's set the scene. The year is 1853. Elizabeth is 15 years old, a Bavarian teenager who has spent more time on horseback than in drawing rooms. She isn't court-trained. She doesn't know the intricate, soul-crushing protocols of the Habsburg dynasty. She doesn't understand imperial choreography. She understands mountains, horses, solitude. And crucially, she wasn't supposed to be empress. Her older sister, Helena, was the chosen one. Helena had been groomed, polished, and meticulously prepped to meet her first cousin, the 23-year-old Emperor of Austria, Franz Joseph I. Yes, first cousins, they're 19th-century royals. They're Habsburgs. The family tree is a wreath, yada yada. Keep up. Helena and Sisi's mother packs them up and drags them to Badischl to finalize Helena's engagement. But their luggage gets lost. Because they are officially in mourning for an aunt, the only clothes they have on their backs are severe, heavy black dresses. For the poised, pale Helena, the black dress makes her look rigid and exhausted. But for the 15-year-old wild child Sisi, who hadn't even bothered to properly style her hair, the black makes her look striking. Franz Josef walks into the room expecting to propose to the perfect corporate wife. Instead, he takes one look at the unprepared, messy younger sister, and his brain completely short-circuits. He makes the most impulsive decision of his rigidly scheduled life. He chooses Elisabeth. Within days, they are engaged. Sisi was allegedly terrified. She wept and told her mother, "I love the emperor. If only he weren't an emperor." Too bad. She was plucked from her quiet life in the woods and thrown headfirst into Vienna's suffocating, hyper-rigid court. It was a promotion she didn't apply for, to a job she didn't want, in a city she already hated. She was not prepared, and frankly, nobody in Vienna cared. If you think your in-laws are tough, let me introduce you to the final boss of toxic boy mums, Archduchess Sophie of Austria. Sophie was the true engine of the Austrian court. She was the one who put Franz Josef on the throne, and she treated the empire like her personal dollhouse. She looked at teenage Elizabeth and didn't see a daughter-in-law. She saw an unbaked clay pot that needed to be fired in the terrifying kiln of imperial discipline. But the absolute worst part? Franz Josef was a massive mama's boy. Imagine marrying the most powerful man in Europe, only to realize he reports back to his mother like a middle schooler. He told Sophie everything. And I mean everything, down to the exact, intimate mechanics of their royal bedchamber. It took the traumatized Sisi and her awkward emperor 3 agonizing days to actually consummate the marriage. How do we know this? Because Sophie was literally documenting it. And the absolute kicker, the morning after they finally sealed the deal, Franz, Sisi, and Sophie all sat down for a lovely morning tea to debrief. Yes, a debrief. Can you imagine the sheer, unadulterated mortification? A 16-year-old girl having her performance reviewed over porcelain cups and pastries by her monster-in-law. Thanks to Franz Josef's inability to keep his mouth shut, the entire aristocratic court knew the intimate details of Sisi's bedroom life before lunchtime. Sophie controlled everything. She controlled Elizabeth's daily schedule. She controlled who she could speak to. The Hofburg Palace wasn't a home. It was a panopticon where Sisi was constantly watched, judged, and criticized. But the most devastating blow? Sophie controlled Sisi's children. When Elizabeth gave birth, Sophie literally marched in, took the babies, and moved the nurseries next to her own apartments. Elizabeth was deemed too immature to raise the heirs to the empire. She had to ask permission just to visit her own kids. Oh, and Sophie even took the liberty of naming the firstborn after herself. Because why not? Elizabeth was isolated, deeply homesick, and spiraling into clinical depression. And then, the first true tragedy hits. In 1857, Sisi insists on taking her 2 young daughters on a trip to Hungary. But on the trip, her firstborn daughter, 2-year-old Sophie, contracts a sickness, likely typhus, and dies in her mother's arms. The grief utterly breaks Elizabeth. She blames herself. Her mother-in-law blames her. She spirals into a dark, paralyzing despair. The court, predictably, offers protocol instead of comfort. She is a mother stripped of her autonomy, mourning a toddler in a palace full of strangers who judge her for crying too loudly. And this grief broke more than just her spirit. It broke her connection to motherhood. Sisi was a grieving mother, yes, but she was also an emotionally inconsistent one. While she completely emotionally detached from her middle daughter, Gisela, She would later dote obsessively on her youngest child, Marie Valerie. She ended up being far warmer to the entire nation of Hungary than she ever was to her own older children. The court had told her she was unfit to be a mother, and eventually she started to believe them. This brings us to the most infamous chapter of her life. The tragedy in Hungary snapped something inside Sisi. She realized a terrifying truth. She could not control the empire. She could not control her mother-in-law. She could not even keep her own children safe. So she looked around, found the one single thing she had absolute jurisdiction over, and seized it with an iron grip: her own body. Elizabeth cultivated a legendary 16-inch waist. She subjected herself to extreme, punishing diets that would terrify a modern nutritionist. She survived for days on nothing but thin broths, salted raw egg whites, and oranges. She occasionally slept with masks made of raw veal strapped to her face to prevent wrinkles. She weighed herself up to 3 times a day, terrified of fluctuating even half a pound. She installed heavy gymnastics equipment, rings, dumbbells, parallel bars in all her palaces, which scandalized the court. Empresses were supposed to sit and sew, not sweat like dock workers. She even exercised relentlessly while pregnant. And then there was the hair. Her hair reached her ankles. Washing it was a full-day, highly classified ritual involving eggs and cognac. Dressing it took 3 hours every single morning. And her hairdresser, Fanny Pfeifferlich, was paid a staggering salary for one terrifying reason. Every morning, Fanny had to count the fallen hairs and present them on a silver tray for the Empress to inspect. If there were too many hairs on that tray, Sisi would fly into a violent rage. The obsession went far deeper than a veal mask. She was literally counting her own shedding. Today, we would not call this discipline. We would call it an eating disorder. Back then, they just called it grace. She used those 3 tense hours in the salon to learn Greek and Hungarian explicitly so she could speak in codes her German-speaking staff couldn't understand. It was a generational clash of royal expectations. The aging Queen Victoria across the Channel supposedly caught wind of this and was deeply unnerved by Elizabeth's intense, obsessive dedication to physical perfection. Victoria embodied duty, weight, and stability. Elizabeth embodied a manic, fragile vanity. Obsession like that doesn't stay contained. It leaks. Whispers said that during an official visit, one of Elizabeth's young daughters recoiled and burst into tears at the sight of Queen Victoria. Now, whether that story is embroidered court gossip or not is almost beside the point. The fact that it circulated tells you everything about the beauty standards those children were raised inside. Appearance wasn't preference, it was hierarchy, it was currency, it was oxygen. When Elizabeth hit 30, she made a radical, brilliant PR decision. She refused to sit for another portrait or photograph. From that moment on, she hid her face behind heavy veils, leather fans, and parasols. If you pointed a camera at her, she'd block her face. She ensured that the public would only ever remember her as eternally young and flawlessly beautiful. Her beauty wasn't just vanity. It was armor. It was her survival strategy in a world that wanted to consume her. Now, what do you do when you are the most famous woman in Europe and you absolutely loathe the people you live with? You write a burn book. Sisi didn't just write a few sad diary entries. Throughout her life as empress, she wrote hundreds of pages of venomous, cynical verse. She called herself Titania from A Midsummer Night's Dream, casting Franz Josef as the literal donkey she was cursed to love. Listen to this. This is what the Empress of Austria wrote about the fairy tale life everyone thought she had. I have awoken in a dungeon, and chains are on my hands, and my longing ever grows, and freedom, you turned from me. And she didn't spare the Viennese public either. While they were buying commemorative plates with her face on them, she was writing poems calling the aristocratic court apes and frogs and mocking their empty lives. But here is the most gangster move of all. She didn't publish them. She knew the Habsburgs would destroy them the second they found them. So she put the manuscripts in a sealed box, handed them to the Swiss president, and left strict instructions. Do not open this until 60 years after my death, and give the proceeds to the orphans of political prisoners. She literally set a 60-year timer on a diss track meant to nuke the Habsburg legacy from beyond the grave. Boss. But let's get one thing straight. Elizabeth was not stupid, and she was not just an ornamental victim weeping in a tower. When she wanted to wield power, she knew exactly how to twist the knife. She developed a deep, almost rebellious emotional attachment to Hungary. Why? Mostly because Vienna hated Hungary and Elizabeth hated Vienna. The enemy of my monster-in-law is my best friend. She learned the incredibly difficult Hungarian language fluently. She fired her Austrian staff and surrounded herself with Hungarian ladies-in-waiting. And then she met Count Gyula Andrássy, handsome, rebellious, previously exiled, and a fierce Hungarian patriot. They were a match made in political heaven. The Viennese court whispered constantly that they were having an affair. When Sisi gave birth to her youngest child, Marie Valerie, the only child she was allowed to raise herself, the gossips cruelly dubbed her the Hungarian child, heavily implying she was Andrássy's. Whether they slept together or not doesn't matter. Their political partnership was undeniable. Elizabeth used her immense manipulative influence over Franz Joseph, who was desperate for her affection, to push through the 1867 Austro-Hungarian Compromise. This wasn't a minor policy shift. It essentially created the dual monarchy and saved the empire from totally collapsing under its own weight. She was crowned Queen of Hungary in a massive, glittering ceremony in Budapest. It proved she was politically lethal when she chose to be. And the ultimate irony? The Austro-Hungarian population absolutely worshipped her, far more than they loved the emperor himself. Oh, and Sophie, the Archduchess who made Sisi's life a living hell, she died in 1872. She never fully softened toward Elizabeth, and she maintained control over court politics until the very end. Sisi survived her monster-in-law, but by the time Sophie was in the ground, the damage to Sisi's psyche was permanent. So what about the man who started all this? The guy who saw his teenage cousin in a black dress and decided to blow up his life. Franz Joseph genuinely adored her. From the day they met to long after she died, he wrote her desperate, loving letters until his own death. He was a creature of habit, a man who woke up at 4 a.m. to do paperwork. He didn't understand her poetry, he didn't understand her diets, and he certainly didn't understand her depression. But he loved her. He also upheld the system that suffocated her. Franz Joseph wasn't just rigid, he was deeply, stubbornly duty-bound. He ruled from 1848 to 1916, making him one of Europe's longest-reigning monarchs. He survived the 1848 revolutions, the Austro-Prussian War, and internal nationalist fractures that were constantly threatening to tear his empire apart. He clung to duty like a life raft. She swam for open water. Elizabeth loved freedom. She withdrew from him emotionally and physically. She couldn't stand the suffocating air of Vienna, the protocols, the endless staring eyes. So she just left. She had a physician declare that Vienna was bad for her health, and she embarked on long, agonizing separations. Well, agonizing for him. She travelled across Europe, the Mediterranean, and England, while he stayed behind in Vienna to push papers and run a crumbling empire. But Elizabeth wasn't completely heartless toward her husband. Recognizing his profound loneliness, she did something incredibly pragmatic. She basically hand-picked a companion for him. She orchestrated a friendship between the emperor and a famous actress named Katharina Schratt. But this wasn't just a brief, scandalous affair. It lasted for decades. It was a publicly tolerated, institutionalized part of their marriage structure. Sisi outsourced her own marriage like a middle manager delegating a task she couldn't be bothered with. She effectively handed off the emotional and companionship labor of her relationship so she could keep running. He got someone to eat pastries with him and listen to him complain about the Prussians. She got the horizon. It emotionally cemented their separation, not as a flighty escape, but as a terminal arrangement. Now, you may be thinking, Sisi has her freedom. Now she can finally be happy. But no. Enter her only son, Crown Prince Rudolf. Rudolf was supposed to inherit it all. He was brilliant, highly sensitive, and deeply, clinically depressed. He was essentially everything his father wasn't, and everything his mother was. He would have probably made a far better ruler than Franz Joseph, and had even occasionally joined political protests in disguise. But he was a liberal trapped under his father's rigidly conservative thumb, politically frustrated, and drowning his misery in a toxic cocktail of morphine, alcohol, and terrible decisions. Like all royals, a suitable marriage was arranged. In 1881, Crown Prince Rudolf married Princess Stephanie of Belgium, the teenage daughter of King Leopold II. They produced one child, Archduchess Elisabeth Marie. For a brief, glittering moment, it may have looked like a fairy tale. It wasn't. Rudolf quickly lost interest. He drank. He brooded. He slept around extensively and eventually contracted a venereal disease, widely believed to have been syphilis. And in a move that truly redefines marital gift, he passed it on to Stephanie. The infection is believed to have left her unable to have more children. Most husbands give their wives jewelry. Rudolf gave her infertility. What a way to make an impact. Speaking of making an impact, fast forward to January 1889. The 30-year-old Rudolf goes to his hunting lodge at Mayerling. With him is his 17-year-old age-inappropriate mistress, Baroness Mary Wetzerer. She's a starry-eyed teenager who thinks she's in a romance novel. She was actually walking into a horror movie. What happens next breaks the empire forever. It's a murder-suicide. Rudolf shoots his teenage mistress in the head and then turns the gun on himself. The court immediately panics and tries to cover it up. They claim it was an aneurysm, a stroke, poison by enemies, anything but the truth. But Elizabeth knows. The officials bring the news to her first, and she is the one who has to walk into her husband's office and tell the emperor that their only son blew his brains out. The Catholic Church initially refused to bury Rudolf because suicide is a sin, and his teenage mistress? She was unceremoniously dumped in an unmarked grave. After Mayerling, Franz Joseph was never the same. He reportedly said, "Nothing has been spared me in this life," and he wasn't exaggerating. He lost his first daughter to illness. His younger brother, Maximilian, was executed by firing squad in Mexico after he crowned himself Emperor of Mexico. He watched his sister-in-law, the former Empress Carlotta of Mexico, descend into lifelong madness. Now he had lost his only son. His wife emotionally vanished. It was mutual ruin. From that day forward, something in Elizabeth permanently died. She gave away every colourful dress she owned. For the rest of her life, she dressed exclusively in heavy mourning black. The Mayerling disaster severed her last remaining emotional tether to Vienna, her husband, and reality. She became a walking ghost, haunting the edges of Europe, just waiting for the end. But Mayerling wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was geopolitical foreshadowing. Because Franz Joseph had no other sons, the line of succession jumped to Rudolph's cousin. You might think that was the end of the tragedy, but no. The line of succession shifted to a distant cousin, Franz Ferdinand. He gets shot in Sarajevo in 1914 by Gavrilo Princip, a disgruntled student and Yugoslav nationalist in protest to the Austrian regime. And that will trigger a war the world hadn't seen before, the so-called War to End All Wars. While World War I wouldn't end up being the war to end all wars in the literal sense, that gunshot and the war itself did change the world forever. It would be the final nail in the coffin that would result in the total collapse of the Habsburg Empire, and the empires around it too. The final decade of her life is a study in profound, restless melancholy. Elizabeth became the wandering empress. She travelled obsessively: Corfu, Geneva, the French Riviera, North Africa. She never stayed in one place for more than a few weeks. She bought a massive yacht and demanded it sail through violent storms while she sat on the deck, tied to a chair, watching the lightning. She developed an intense obsession with the sea, even getting an anchor tattooed on her shoulder in a seedy port tavern. Yes, the Empress of Austria got inked. Deal with it. She spent her days speed-walking for 8 hours straight in the pounding rain, literally exhausting her ladies-in-waiting to the point where they needed carriages to follow behind and pick up the ones who collapsed. She withdrew entirely from politics. She spent her time reading the dark, cynical poetry of Heinrich Heine, convinced his ghost was communicating with her. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was slowly fracturing around her. The world was modernizing, but she didn't care anymore. Geneva, 10th of September, 1898. Elizabeth is 60 years old. She's walking along the promenade toward a ferry, accompanied by a single lady-in-waiting. She is travelling incognito under the fake name Countess of Hohenems. Enter Luigi Lucchini, a 25-year-old Italian anarchist. He hates royalty. He hates the rich. He hates the system. He originally came to Geneva intending to assassinate the Duke of Orléans to make a political statement, but the Duke had already left town. Lucchini is furious. He reads a leaked report in the local paper that the Empress of Austria is secretly staying at a nearby hotel. He doesn't care who she is. She's royalty. She becomes a target of opportunity. As Elizabeth walks toward the boat, Lucchini runs up, peers under her parasol to confirm her identity, and seemingly bumps hard into her chest. Elizabeth falls backward, but being the physically conditioned athlete she is, she gets right back up. She brushes herself off. She tells her panicked lady-in-waiting that she's fine, assumes a thug just tried to steal her watch, and walks the rest of the way onto the ferry. But Lucchini hadn't just bumped into her. He had stabbed her directly in the heart with a crude, sharpened industrial file. She didn't realize she'd been stabbed because the wound was so small. She thought she'd just been shoved. The blade was incredibly thin, and her black corset was laced so unbelievably tight that it acted as a tourniquet, temporarily stopping the external bleeding. The corset that defined her life bought her a few more minutes to lose it. The boat leaves the dock. A few minutes out on the water, Elizabeth turns pale and collapses. Her corset is finally cut open, revealing a single tiny drop of blood over her heart. When asked if she was in pain, she reportedly replied, "No. What has happened?" Her final recorded words. She then bled to death internally. Cinematic, quiet, brutal. Sisi spent her whole life making sure the world only saw what she wanted them to see. The frozen portrait, the perfect waist, the veiled face. And then, from beyond the grave, she finally said what she actually thought. 60 years after they buried her, the box opened. The poems came out, the apes and the frogs on the dungeon and the chains. The chocolate boxes kept selling. The musicals kept running. Vienna kept franchising her face. She would have hated every single second of it. But somewhere, the ghost of a woman who tied herself to a ship's mast in a storm just to feel something is absolutely delighted that you're hearing this. Welcome to the fire, Sisi. You earned it.